See, normally in the old days, I just would have gotten started like 10 minutes ago, but now with the whole broadcast thing.
There you go. You got your thumb.
I got my thumb? I got a thumb. All right. We're ready to get started then. It's always great being back up here. Appreciate you guys putting up with me and kind of listening to me ramble on, but we're still going to be in the book of Genesis. But before we get into the lesson, does anybody not have the opportunity to take the Lord's Supper this morning? Or downstairs? Okay, just want to make sure we get that out there for everyone. So who did we focus on the last time I was up here? About a month ago. Who was our primary figure we talked about? Cue the cricket sound, please. Joseph, yes. Joseph was who we talked about. Who were Joseph's parents? Ooh. Who were Joseph's parents? Did I hear something? Jacob and Rachel? There we go. Remember our nice little chart up here? What number son was Joseph? It's up there. Yep, number 11. So is this a high rank in the family or is this a low on the pecking order type person? Right, Joseph was at the bottom. However, how was he treated by his father? As what? Yep, he was basically treated as number way above number 1. He was a very spoiled kid. What was the best sign of this that we can see from the Bible? His coat of many colors. Now that coat was, a special sign that he's, set apart. He's the favorite son. But that coat in particular had to symbolize to the other brothers a lack of love from their father to them as well. So that coat kind of had two different symbols. Put him up on a pedestal, but it also symbolized a lack of love, I think, to the others. All right, along with being pretty spoiled, Joseph also seems to be pretty much a brat, even at the age of 17. He probably lied to his father about his brothers out in the field. Remember, he came back and gave a bad report, likely a lie. And then he had a couple dreams about being honored by his family that he kept to himself, or nope, he rushed off to his other brothers and to his father saying, you guys are going to bow down to me one day. What was the result that the Bible says about his brothers' feelings towards him? They used the H word. Hated. His brothers hated him for this, along with all of his other little actions, and partially the fault of his father because he showed favoritism to one of his sons. We're never supposed to do that as a parent. That's just, a hint. Sometime after the dreams, the brothers are with the flocks about 50 miles away from camp. So they were camped out down here in Hebron. He goes up to Shechem, then eventually up to Dothan, about 50 miles. He finds his brothers because his father is worried about them. Apparently they've been away for a while. So he sends Joseph to check on them. After wandering around the countryside for a while, we kind of talked about that, Joseph finally finds him. But his brothers, they see him approaching from off in the distance. How did they likely recognize him? That special colorful coat. Exactly, coming up over the hill. So what do the brothers want to do? They want to kill him. However, somebody intercedes. Who is that? Reuben prevents them from carrying out their plan. So what did they decide to do instead? Well, first of all, they threw him in the pit. There we go. This was likely a cistern, an empty cistern. Didn't have water in it. But it makes a really good holding cell if it followed anything like this design that I have up there. So they throw them in the pit. They sit down to have a meal while they think about what they're going to do. Reuben goes off to watch the flock. And then the other brothers, as they sit down to eat, they see something off in the distance. What was that? A caravan of Ishmaelites and Midianites. They're distant relatives. They're heading to Egypt. They're traders to sell their wares. This gives Judah an idea. What was it? Instead of killing him, let's sell him. We're not going to get any money if we just kill him. Let's sell him off as a slave. The brothers agree, and while they probably don't get top dollar for him, they do get a little money in their pockets, and Joseph is out of their lives for what they think is forever. So I mentioned last time, this is a theory on my part, Judah is the one that makes this suggestion of selling him. And even though the rest of the book of Genesis really focuses on Joseph, I think the most important lesson that we get is really from Judah. We see the transformation of Judah from this point where he wants to kill and sell his brother to the end of Genesis, what we'll get to, who knows, months from now maybe, and see him in a totally different light and see the maturity of Judah. And he's actually going to be our primary focus today that we're going to get to. All right, so that was a little side note. So the caravan continues on to the journey to Egypt. The brothers sit back down to have their meal. They're a little richer. And now we're going to pick up in chapter 37 of Genesis, where we picked off last week. All right, so Genesis 37. Any comments, questions, criticisms? All right, 37, towards the end of the book, if you want to flip there. So the deal is made. Joseph is off to Egypt. It must have been a fairly quick exchange because Reuben gets back after everything is already done. What's his reaction when he sees the empty pit? Verses 29 and 30. Now Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, so he exactly tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is not there. As for me, where am I to go?" So the tearing of garments is an expression of sadness and grief that we see several times in the Bible. This is a fairly common occurrence, to tear your garments and sit in sackcloth. It's a way of demonstrating your sadness, your mourning. So we see Reuben acting that way now. Now Reuben, before Joseph was sold, he seemed pretty reluctant to share his feelings with the other brothers. Granted, he stood up and said, "Okay, let's not kill him, let's just throw him in a pit." I guess that's better than saying, "Let's kill him," but it really doesn't seem to share what he's feeling at this moment. And now he has no reluctance in sharing his feelings with his brothers. However, it's too late. He can't do anything about it at this point because Joseph is miles away, already sold as a slave. Even if he were to run after him, I mean, the deal's made. They're not going to give him back. They've already paid for him. Joseph belongs to these guys now. The brothers obviously know where Reuben stands, so this is just, I think it's another good lesson about missed opportunities that we as Christians can carry on today. I've been saying this repeatedly. The Old Testament is full of lessons that are just as applicable to us today in the New Testament that we can learn. The likely reason that Reuben is upset is why? Because he even says, "As for me, where am I to go?" Why is he so upset? I mean, they're all in this collectively. They've got to go home to dad, but Reuben, what's special about him? He's the oldest. He's kind of the de facto head of the group here. The responsibility is going to be on his head if Jacob ever finds out what's happened. Not to worry, though, the brothers have a plan. They take Joseph's coat, this special one-of-a-kind coat that must have been thrown to the side when they tore it off Joseph before they tossed him in the pit. They kill a goat and they dip the coat in the blood. What's the implication in here? Something killed him. All right, we don't know how much time passes, but the brothers eventually return home with the blood-stained coat. Starting in verse 32. They brought it to their father and said, "We found this. Please examine it to see whether it is your son's tunic or not." Then Jacob examined it. "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast must have devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." They have the intended effect here. Now, did you notice what the brothers say? "Your son's tunic." Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but it seems like they still have so much hatred that they can't even say "our brother." He has no part of us. It's your son's coat. It just seems like an interesting way of saying that. Either way, Jacob doesn't suspect any kind of foul play. The brothers must have all breathed kind of a collective sigh of relief. We got away with it. They're off the hook. However, Jacob is devastated and he reacts accordingly. Look at verse 34. And so Jacob tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. So again, we see that same example of the tearing of clothes. He is devastated. He even says a couple of verses from now, essentially, I'm going to mourn him the rest of my life. I am so upset I have lost my favorite son. This was a terrible moment for Jacob. I mean, I can't even imagine losing a child. But he has lost his son, his favorite son, and he demonstrates that grief appropriately here. But at least Jacob still has the rest of his family, right? To keep him through the grief. Look at verse 35. Then all of his sons and his daughters arose and comforted him. All of his sons, oh, Dad, it's okay. We're still here for you. Kind of ironic. They're the ones that got rid of him. They're the ones that are making their father think he's dead, and yet they're the ones that comfort him. Do we see a transformation here? They've suddenly realized what they've done is wrong, or are they just really good actors? There's a lot of brothers. My guess is maybe there's a combination of it. But either way, Jacob is devastated, but he's surrounded by his family. Then we get verse 36, which closes out chapter 37. This is the meanwhile down in Egypt kind of segue. Verse 36. See, meanwhile, the Midianites sold him, meaning Joseph, in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. So at the end of Genesis 37, Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt, and his story is going to continue in chapter 39. However, thrown right in the middle of these two chapters is the history of, again, Judah, like I said, and a woman named Tamar. All right, as a warning, first of all, any question about Joseph, chapter 37? Questions, comments, thoughts? Okay, so 38, my warning, this is not a G-rated chapter. This has some adult themes in it. I'm going to put those delicately, but the Bible is a book of real history and real people. These are events that happen in life, so that's my warning. 38, thrown right in the middle of Joseph's story, who appears to be, like I said, the focus of the last part of Genesis. So why is this part of Judah's life important for us to know about? You've got to ask that question. Why is this thrown right in the middle? It's got to be important. It's in the Bible. First of all, it reinforces, again, like I said, my thought that Judah actually is the one that we learn the best lesson from in the book of Genesis. But we'll just work through the chapter, hopefully get through it today, and then we'll kind of talk about why it's important a little bit later. All right, so 38 starts off with Judah visiting a local man named Hira. During this visit, he meets a woman that he marries, and together they have 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. Once the first son grows up, Judah appears to arrange a marriage between him and the woman named Tamar. All right, first of all, we need to talk about timing. Judah is only a little older than Joseph. So how old was Joseph when he was sold as a slave to Egypt? 17, maybe he had a birthday, maybe it's 18, but right around in that time. This chapter likely covers the 20 to 25 years between Joseph being sold into slavery and the time the brothers really meet Joseph again. So you kind of have the slavery, and then you have this story of Judah, and then you have chapter 39, which kind of comes back and starts at that same timeline again. See, this one chapter covers probably, like I said, 20 to 25 years up until the later part of Genesis. So that's the timing part. So Judah's first son marries Tamar, but apparently Judah's son is a pretty bad individual. Because what happens to him? Verse 7 says that God took his life because of his evil ways. Again, a couple things to note here. Why was the son so evil? Why did he turn out that way? Now, based on the previous chapters of Genesis, we see that his father in particular wasn't really the best role model. Judah wanted to kill Joseph along with the brothers. Reuben's the one that talks him into the pit, or talks him just to throw him in the pit. But then Judah's the one that has the idea, okay, if we can't kill him, let's at least make some profit off of him. Let's sell the guy. Now, I don't think Judah's just having an evil day right now, that he's just a great guy and he's just having a really bad day. I'm assuming this is kind of how Judah is in everyday life. This is just how he's acting. And Judah probably isn't teaching his children how to be a respectable and God-fearing people. So, again, a New Testament lesson. What are we teaching our children? More importantly, what do they see us doing in our lives that they're learning from us, even if we're not trying to teach it to them? You gotta love the Old Testament. It's so applicable to us today. All right, number 2. How evil did Judah's son have to be for God to take his life? How many times did God just kill people in the Bible? That's not really a real question, but not very often is the answer. Are there any bad people in the Bible that you would have think God could have killed? You can draw the inference here, but apparently God was not so happy with him that he felt he needed to remove him from the face of the earth. Must have been pretty bad. So Judah is left a widow, but Judah has a plan to take care of her. What's that? The next son, verse 8. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go in to your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother." Judah tells his second son, "Take Tamar as his wife, raise up offspring," which will then be the deceased brother's son legally, even though he's dead. Was Onan already married? I don't know. But that seems to be the practice of the day. I mean, he says, go do your duty as a brother. This doesn't appear to be something that Judah just made up. That seems to be the practice, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So God's plan, take a little sidetrack here, is for one man and one woman to be married as husband and wife. We see this repeatedly in the Bible. We see it demonstrated in the Garden of Eden, when God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and his many wives. We also see God's plan in the books of Timothy and Titus, when he's talking about church leadership, and Paul lays out stipulations for married to one wife, not many wives. We also see it again in Ephesians, where Paul is speaking about the relationship of one husband and one wife. Now, it's interesting because this is a lot different than a lot of other worldly religions, especially like Islam. We hear about that constantly. What's the goal of an Islamic fighter? You die, go to heaven, and you get 70 virgins. And they call Christianity sexist. So God's plan is one man to be married to one woman. This is very clear. So based on this, why, jumping to the book of Deuteronomy 25, if you want to turn to that, which Deuteronomy is after the events of Judah and Tamar, when Judah says to his second son, go in and do your duty, why does God lay out what he did in Deuteronomy 25? Let's look at verses 5 through 10. This is the giving of the law to the Israelites. This is God's law to them, starting in verse 5. When brothers live together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a strange man. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her to himself as wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. Those words sound pretty familiar, don't they? That's exactly what Judah says earlier on before this law was given. Verse 6. It shall be that the firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name of his dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. But if the man does not desire to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to establish a name for his brother in Israel. He is not willing to perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the city shall summon him and speak to him. And if he persists and says, I do not desire to take her, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the sight of the elders, pull his sandal off his foot, and spit in his face. That sounds like a pleasant experience. And she shall declare, this it is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. In Israel his name shall be called the house of him whose sandal is removed. Man, if that's an insult, go out and call somebody that on the street and get some weird looks at you. It was clearly the practice, based on what Judah said here to a second son, for the deceased husband's brother to care for his brother's widow, based on what we read back in Genesis 35. 38. You can turn back there if you want to. So God, he's not really stipulating this as much as allowing it to happen. He's not establishing this as a new custom. This is what the practice was. But yet it does have spiritual implications. First of all, and there's stipulations here within Deuteronomy 25. First of all, they have to be living together in the same family unit. Second, his brother can't have already had a son before he died. I could be wrong, but I don't see there's any place in the Bible where it says for the husband's brother to marry the widow if that brother already had a son. The whole goal to take the widow was to keep his lineage, keep his line alive. So there wasn't a requirement to marry if that son already existed. And you have to remember, genealogy was super important to the Hebrew people. Why was that? What did God establish as his people? He used their physical identity as descendants of Abraham. Those were his people. It wasn't so much a spiritual identity, even though that was involved. It was a physical identity of the Hebrew people that made them gods. That's why keeping the line alive in that genealogy was so important to them. So now, we have this law laid out in Deuteronomy. The Bible is the Bible. Does it still apply to us today? Are we supposed to go out and take our sister-in-law and marry her? No, and kind of yes. Don't throw anything yet. Hear me out. How are we identified as God's people today? Is it through a physical family? It's through a spiritual family. So in that sense, the same Old Testament principle actually does kind of carry through us today. If the husband of a Christian couple passes away and the widow decides to remarry, is she to look out into the world for a husband? Or is she to look within the worldwide, the church, for a new husband? Now, we're told in 2 Corinthians 6 that Christians are to marry Christians. So the answer is if she wants to remarry, is to look within the own family, the own brotherhood, to take a husband from. Does this kind of make sense? Now, I think if you look at it in this sense, it kind of puts the culture we live at, this is kind of repulsive in a way, to take your sister-in-law as your wife. But if you look at what identified them as the people of God and what identifies us today, and put it in the sense of that widow trying to find a husband within the church, a brother, technically, I think that maybe takes some of that stigmatism away from what's being accomplished here. The whole goal is for people to remain within the identity of God's family. All right, that was my sidetrack. Kind of makes sense? All right, I'm with you. Back to Tamar and Onan. Onan, he's been told, go take your sister-in-law as your wife, do your duty. Listens to a father, and he has an intimate moment with Tamar as husband and wife. However, he goes into this occasion with some pretty selfish motives. He wants to enjoy the pleasure of the moment, but he takes steps that you can read about in verse 9 to make sure that a child isn't the result. I'm putting this delicately, but you get the idea. The result is verse 10. But what he did was displeasing in the sight of God. so he took his life also. Not good. All right, Judah has now lost 2 out of the 3 sons, but he still gives at least the impression of wanting to take care of Tamar. Look at verse 11. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah," the third one, "grows up." Apparently, Shelah was pretty young because Judah tells Tamar, "You go back to your father's house, you can go home, but you wait. Just wait, and when Shelah grows up, you can marry him. That's what we do. You can then have my third son." Is Judah serious about this offer? No. Look at verse 11. "For he thought, I am afraid that he too may die like his brothers. So Tamar went and lived in her father's house." Judah just wants to get rid of Tamar. And can you really blame him? I mean, she's already kind of been I don't know if she was the result of number 1, but maybe she's bad luck. He just wants her out of the picture. Just give it away. I want to keep my third son. Why? Because sons is how your lineage stays within God's family. You want to preserve at least one of your sons. It's not just that he loves the third son so much, I think there's also a part of, he's my descendant, my name will die out if something happens to him. All right, verse 12, it says that a considerable amount of time passes, and that during that time, Judah's wife dies, and that Judah mourns for her. It then says that Judah and his old friend Hira, remember, the guy he knew before he met his wife, they take a little trip together, and Tamar hears about it. Tamar, by this time, has apparently figured out that she's figured out Judah's game, because the third son now seems to have grown up, and no one has come to get Tamar and thrown the wedding ceremony. She then decides to take matters into her own hands. She changes out of her widow's garments that she's been wearing. She's been wearing these things for years, signifying, I'm a widow. I am waiting on the next son to grow up. This is a constant reminder. Every day she puts on those same widow's clothes. Every day. And the next day, I'm a widow. And the next day, I'm waiting for this son. The next day, the son's grown up now. What's going to happen? This is a constant, almost a little bit of a torture for this woman to always be reminded, my husbands have died. I'm waiting. He's not coming. You can see kind of the hopelessness building within Tamar. She doesn't think she has another option. She takes matters into her own hands. She changes out of those widow's garments, disguises her face, and goes to where she knows Judah is going to pass by on his trip. All right, there's another new picture. It has no relevance, but at least gives you something to look at. I don't know if that's what they look like. Probably not. Judah passes by, and he thinks that Tamar is a prostitute, which is exactly her plan. I doubt she was just sitting off to the side of the road waiting to be noticed. I imagine she made her intentions very clear when Judah came along. She signified that, hey, I am available for hire. I'm a prostitute. Her actions have the planned result, and Judah and Tamar begin to work out the terms of the arrangement. Tamar asks Judah what he's willing to pay. Judah responds that he'll send a young goat. Tamar doesn't want a goat. She wants a child. But she also wants some security. She wants something that she can hold over Judah's head as a guarantee. Specifically, she asked for his cord and seal and his staff. She asked for those 3 things. I don't exactly know how or what they look like, but somehow those items were identifiable to Judah. They could not be misconstrued as anybody else's. Those were Judah's items. They were specific. Judah agrees, and their little encounter takes place. Okay, let me say again. This is not what God wants. This is not an example we're supposed to use in, our New Testament lives. He's very clear that this kind of intimacy should only take place between a husband and wife. We see that multiple times again in the Bible. Tamar saw this as her only option, which it wasn't, and Judah continues to make poor life decisions. He's very good at this. Everyone in this story is at fault. Let me be clear. Everyone is at fault in this story. However, God still uses them even through their flaws. Again, is that applicable to us? Are we all perfect people? Do we have flaws? God can still use us. He doesn't like what we do. Don't get me wrong. He's not approving what's going on here. He's not saying this is the way we should live our lives. But he's saying, I can still use you people because I love you. That's the lesson here. Judah obviously knows his daughter-in-law. She had lived in his house for years. So does it seem strange that he doesn't recognize her? Have you ever thought about that? Maybe a little bit. But there are several reasons why he wouldn't necessarily get that it's her. First of all, it had been several years since Tamar had lived in Judah's house, where he probably saw her every single day. So it's likely that, okay, he's a little less familiar with her at this point, because it was years ago when that happened. People grow up, people change, maybe a little bit different, a little less familiar. All right, second of all, she initially had her face covered. We read that in the text. And it's likely that this face covering continued through the whole encounter, which, based on the culture, that would have been the only part of her that Judah would have recognized. So she had that cover the whole time. Third, Judah isn't in his community anymore. He is far away on a trip with his friends. So he has no expectation whatsoever that Judah is going to be where he is going. So, as an example, has anyone been on a trip before, like a long distance trip, and you run into somebody like from your own little town and they wave, hey, and you think, I know you, but I'm not home, so it possibly can't be you, and you try to talk yourself out of it being that person? I've done this. Maybe I'm the only one, but it's like, I'm not home. That cannot be you. I'm not going to embarrass myself by going over and saying hi. I think this is kind of it as well. Judah's not expecting Tamar to be in that place, and he's certainly not expecting her to be a prostitute on the side of a road. So maybe he just mentally is talking himself out of it as well. Either way, he doesn't have any suspicion whatsoever that the woman he's performing this act with is actually his daughter-in-law, Tamar. After the encounter, with Judah, Tamar returned to her father's home, changed back into her widow's clothes. You don't want to be wearing prostitute's clothes when you're at home. Just change back into your widow's clothes. Judah follows through with his end of the goat deal, possibly just because he wanted his stuff back. Would he have sent the goat if she didn't take his stuff? Maybe, maybe not. Based on Judah's past choices in life, I'm going to sell my brother as a slave. Probably not going to keep up his end of the deal with a prostitute either. Just want my stuff back. But he sends the goat, he sends a servant with him to find what he thought was the local prostitute. The servant can't find her, and when he asks around, no one seems to remember seeing her either. That makes me begin to think that her actions were very targeted towards Judah. She probably just acted like a normal woman until she saw him, and that's when she went into the prostitute routine. No one remembers even seeing her. The servant returns with the animal to Judah, who seems like he just wants to sweep the whole thing under the rug. Okay, I'll get a new staff, I'll make a new seal, and, accord. 3 months go by, and Judah gets a surprise. Chapter 38, verse 24. Your daughter-in-law, Tamar, has played the harlot, and behold, she is also with child by harlotry. What's Judah's reaction? Look at the last part of the verse. Then Judah said, bring her out to be burned. This is to kill her, not, very clear, kind of a tie to the stake and burn her type thing. Again, a couple things we can look at here. Number one, hypocrite. Okay, moving on to number two. Tamar is living in her father's house. She's not even living in Judah's household anymore. So how does Judah have the authority to pass such a harsh sentence on someone who's not even in his house anymore? Ever thought about that? Even though Tamar wasn't physically a part of Judah's house, she still answered to him. Remember, this is the clan, the family type of culture. When she married Judah's son, she became a member of that clan. Even though she physically wasn't living there anymore, she was still under Judah's authority. And he, as the ruler, had the right to pass this type of harsh judgment. She made him look bad. She's getting pregnant by someone that she's out of wedlock with. That's an insult to Judah, and he can have her removed from the face of the earth. That is within his right as the leader of the group. However, Judah's reaction plays exactly into Tamar's hands. Look at verse 25. It was while she was being brought out, basically being walked to the execution stake, that she sent to her father-in-law saying, I am with child by the man to whom these things belong. And she said, please examine and see whose signet ring and cords and staff are these. What would have happened if she didn't get these items? She'd have been killed. It would have been his word versus her word. Who would have won in that culture? Him. That's just the way it was. Man's word trumps woman's word. And especially clan leader versus someone else lower, he was going to win every time. If she had only had one item, what would have happened? Exactly, one item. Well, yeah, that was missing. It was stolen. She must have taken it, and she's trying to blackmail me. Again, who would have probably won that argument? Judah. What would have happened to Tamar? Death. But she had 3 of his very personable, very identifiable items. Now today, I'm talking about cell phone, driver's license, and passport. Essentially, that's what she has on Judah. Judah at this point has to face the music. He has to realize, uh-oh, I made a mistake. I may have had a little involvement. Put the fire out, boys. Let's talk about this a little bit more. The jig's up. Verse 26. Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not have relations with her again. Here is kind of that turning point, I think, in Judah's life, in his life. We finally start to see him grow up. Up to this point, we only see him making poor choices. Let's go in and loot the city of Shechem after my brothers have killed everybody. Hey, let's kill our brother. Nope, let's sell him as a slave. Okay, hey, there's a prostitute, looks bad. Let's go for that. Poor choices his entire life. But here, he's starting to grow up. Now, and in the next couple chapters, we start to see Judah taking responsibility for his own actions. I mean, Zach just spoke about the consequences of our actions, which you learned from Daniel, which you learned from here, which you learned from multiple stories, a lot of which are in the Old Testament. Our lives are lives of consequences, good and bad, just like he pointed out. And we, as Christians, make mistakes. We, before we have become Christians, have made mistakes. Once we become Christians, do all those problems just go away? Or do we have to live with them the rest of our life? As Christians, the mistakes we make, we can get forgiven for them, but we still have to deal with them as people. And we start seeing now in the story Judah taking responsibility and starting to make, I think, a little better choices in life. Even towards the end of Genesis, starting to put others even before himself, which is really the final, I think, transformation of Judah, which has good consequences for him at the very, very end of the book, which again we'll probably get to in 2022. All right, chapter 38 ends with Tamar giving birth to twin boys named Perez and Zerah. So why is this account important? Other than learning about Judah, why is this chapter thrown right in just the middle of what seems to be the story of Joseph? First of all, there's really good lessons in it for us that I think we've talked about, and hopefully you've picked up on. Otherwise, I've presented them very poorly, because they're very good lessons. Now, turn to Matthew chapter 1. Matthew chapter 1. Start right in the very beginning of verse 1. The record of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez was the father of Hezron, and Hezron was the father of Ram, and so forth. The story is also important to us because it helps us understand the genealogy of who? Jesus Christ. Does he have any important part in the Bible or our lives in general? Just a little bit yet? It really reminds us the Bible is full of sinful people just like us. In the Old Testament specifically had some people that made really, really bad decisions in their lives. Judah made poor decisions in chapter 38, but he had to live with those consequences. I mean, he had shame on him probably the rest of his life. If you don't go sleep with your daughter-in-law and just sweep that under the rug, people are going to remember that and think poorly of you for it, even if they don't say it to your face. You're going to have a very bad reputation from that point on. He had to live with that, but the amazing thing is that God did and is still able to use us who make some pretty bad decisions, or maybe I'm the only one in life, but I think we all have made poor decisions in our lives. It also doesn't matter where we come from. That's the other important lesson of this. Jesus came from a man who was just looking for some sinful pleasure and a woman who was trying to trick that man into giving her a son. She was selling her own body. That's some great ancestors you want to look back on and put highly up on the mantle there. Was she the only prostitute within the line of Jesus Christ? Who was the other one? Rahab. If Jesus had come from a perfect family who lived perfect and non-sinful lives, I think he'd be a little bit harder for us to relate to. Anybody have some family members that they don't really want to bring up in conversation? I've got them. They're not going to be the first ones I brag about. It doesn't matter where we come from. We are all individuals. God loves us because of who we are, not because of who our parents were. And if our parents were God-fearing, devout Christians, you know what? That doesn't matter either. We have to answer for ourselves. Our parents can't get us into heaven, just like they can't keep us out of heaven. It doesn't matter where we come from. God loves us, and we are responsible for our own selves and our own relationship with God. That's why I think Genesis 38 is an important chapter. Even though, again, like I said, it has some very adult themes, which I didn't see anybody blush, and hopefully I put it delicately, like I said. Comments or questions? Nothing? All right. Tom, would you mind closing us in prayer, please?